In this video, we're going to take a look at Luke's redactional activity regarding the start of his passion narrative. So we're going to be in Luke chapter 22. And so this just gives an illustration of the kinds of things that Luke was interested in. When we talk about his redaction activity, what we're looking at here is Luke has received material, information about the death of Jesus, the things that are leading up to the death of Jesus, his crucifixion. And we see some of this tradition in Mark's gospel. We can make comparisons with it in Matthew's. But we're looking here at what seems to be kind of unique for Luke. And when Luke wants to tell this story, and as he adds things, he is tipping his hand, as it were, to themes or ideas that are important to him. So I'll begin here, first of all, by just reading the passage from Luke chapter 22. I'm going to start just with the first few verses. Now, the festival of unleavened bread, called the Passover, was approaching, and the chief priest and the teachers of the law were looking for some way to get rid of Jesus, but they were afraid of the people. Then Satan entered Judas, called Iscariot, one of the 12, and Judas went to the chief priest and the officer of the temple guard and discussed with them how he might betray Jesus. They were delighted and agreed to give him money. He consented and watched for an opportunity to hand Jesus over to them when no crowd was present. So a couple of things here to note. What's interesting here. So one of the things that Luke does is he picks up as Mark's text this idea of the festival of unleavened bread called Passover. Now, technically, there's a distinction between these two. The festival of unleavened bread occurs after the day of Passover, but they're using these terms kind of as a way of descriptive of the events that take place during this week. So we're also get this insight about the motivation for Judas to carry out his betrayal. So Luke is unique in saying that Satan entered into Judas. So that's not something we see in Mark or in Matthew. Now, we do get the same kind of idea or thought in John's gospel, but we don't believe that Luke has access to John's gospel. But we may have indication of an early tradition that was ascribing satanic or demonic activity involved with Judas's betrayal. We also see here something about what's going on with Judas. Now, maybe in Matthew's account, Judas is doing this for purposes for money, but that's not quite clear that that is Judas's intent here. It is agreed, so that might is agreed to pay him money, and so that might indicate that he came asking for it, so that might be insinuated that he did. Or it could be that he had his own reasons why he wanted Jesus to be arrested, especially if Satan has entered him to do something evil, to do something harmful to Jesus, and wasn't doing it because he wanted money, but because he came. The chief priest then agreed to pay him to do that. But, again, we're just seeing something distinctive here with Luke in saying that Satan entered into Judas. Luke, as well as Mark, also has interest in, demonic possessions or the activities of Jesus' battles, as it were, with, devils or demons in his ministry. And so this idea that what is taking place here with Jesus and this betrayal is all kind of an effort that's going on by these satanic influences. So move to the Last Supper. So there's the Last Supper is quite extensive, starting with verse 7 and really moving on to all the way up to verse 38. So it's a lengthy section, so I'm not going to read all of that section, but I just want to highlight one particular thing in this account. So during the supper, as it's being celebrated, we have this cup. Now, Luke again is the only one that talks really about two cups, but one of the cups that we have here is the cup that's offered here in verse 20. In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you." So now there are some manuscript evidence that may not have the "for you" or "given for you," uh, but just this language of "this is the cup of the new covenant in my blood." And this language echoes Jeremiah 31:31. So this is not something we have in Mark or in Matthew's account, the idea of the cup of the new covenant. And so it looks like there maybe have what has arisen is some reflection about the cup that Jesus blesses here, and linking it then to this idea of a new covenant, seeing the early Christian community itself as this new covenant people that Jeremiah anticipated. So again, here is something that we see of an importance for Luke as he is telling these events or describing these events and connecting these events, particularly with prophetic activities or prophetic texts. Luke has a strong interest in prophets and prophetic texts. Not that others don't, but certainly Luke has a great deal of interest in that. Also, we see that Jesus predicts his betrayal as the Son of Man in verse 22. So, the prediction of betrayal taking place here is interesting, and especially the self description of Jesus as the Son of Man, a phrase that occurs in gospel traditions. So when Jesus uses this language of Son of Man, it's a little bit tricky to understand in what sense Jesus is using this expression. The expression, as best as we know at the time that Jesus used it, could have a couple of different references. In one way, the phrase Son of Man can be used to describe um, generically a human being. So if someone says something to or might think of a passage in Scripture, "What is man that thou art mindful of him, or the Son of Man that thou would consider him?" So in that Hebrew parallelism, Son of Man and man or humans in generic terms are kind of equated. So one could use this phrase Son of Man to talk about human beings in general. And there are places possible in the gospel where Jesus is using the phrase Son of Man for generic terms. So I think in Mark's gospel, we see an expression that Jesus uses where he's talking about the Sabbath, and he'll say, that the man was not created for the Sabbath, but Sabbath was created for man. Therefore, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Well, it makes sense that if the Sabbath is created for man, that the Son of Man there should be understood as human beings. Human beings are Lord of the Sabbath. Now, I know that's not the way in which a lot of people treat that expression, that for many people it's going to be used this other way of the Son of Man that we're also aware of. That other way is as what we call a circumlocution. So as a circumlocution, it's a roundabout way of talking about oneself. So you could use the phrase Son of Man when you are referring to yourself. And it's clear that in several places in the gospel traditions and in Luke, that he may have this Son of Man use, especially when he's talking about being betrayed and being killed and on the third day rising. Well, clearly this is a reference to Jesus. Now, Son of Man was also used to refer to an eschatological figure, a figure who is supposed to come at the end of the age. And so we see, this language particularly in the book of First Enoch, and we see something of this as well in the book of Daniel, where Daniel 7, we have a Son of Man figure. And so some Jews then were expecting this semi-divine individual who would come at the end of the age and bringing vindication for the righteous and bringing vengeance to the unrighteous. And so there may be times in which Jesus will use that phrase, Son of Man. I'm particularly thinking in Matthew's Gospel, where he's got that phrase, Son of Man, to refer to this figure that's going to come. Now, once again, in Christian tradition, because we do know that Jesus uses Son of Man as a circumlocution for himself, when we see that phrase, Son of Man, very oftentimes we think then that Jesus is talking to himself and his role of coming in at the end of the age. So, there's one more fourth way in which Son of Man was used, at least as evidence in the book of Daniel, and that is Son of Man to kind of refer to the people of Israel as a whole, because they are the figures, the saints, as it were, in Daniel 7, are the ones who receive the kingdom. The righteous receive the kingdom. So the Son of Man figure there is representative of the people of Israel. I don't really know that Jesus ever used it that way in the Gospel. It's not very clear that he ever does use it in that way. There is, one text that I think he might have used it in that way, and that is when he talks about the Son of Man has no place to lie his head. It's a very cryptic type of saying. Why is it that the Son of Man doesn't have a place to lie his head, or doesn't have a place to rest? Is it talking about Jesus, which is kind of odd for Jesus to say that when it looks like from Mark's Gospel, Jesus does have a home in Capernaum. What does it mean if it's human beings, that human beings don't have a place to lie their heads? Does it make much sense for the eschatological figure, Son of Man, not to have a place to lie his head? So maybe for Israel, not to have a place to lie their head, in other words, not to have a home, because right now, or at this time of Jesus, Israel doesn't have their own home. They don't own the land. They don't possess the land themselves. And so they are wandering, as it were. But you got to read it within the context, and would that make much sense? And that's where part of the problem is. So there are like 4 different uses for Son of Man. So here it seems that the Son of Man is being used as that circumlocution sense. In other words, is Jesus talking to himself about how he is going to go as it's been decreed for him. And the question really then becomes, who's going to betray Jesus? They don't have any concern about who Jesus is talking about. They know that he's talking about himself. And so this leads to the discussion about greatness. Now, this conversation about greatness occurs in Matthew's Gospel in a different place. So there's this tradition that this discussion about greatness occurred amongst the disciples, but for Luke, he decides to place this material here when Jesus is once again reminding his disciples about what's getting ready to happen to him. And so here, greatness is kind of connected with Jesus' self-sacrifice. And so in Luke's Gospel, self-sacrifice, daily self-sacrifice, is an important thing. And the idea about serving one another. And so if anybody wants to do that, that's how they become great in the kingdom of Christ. And then finally, I'm just going to end here by looking at an unusual thing in the prayer at the Mount of Olives. So this is from verses 39 through 46. And so once again, we have this tradition both in Matthew and in Mark's Gospel. And so from this, what's kind of interesting is verses 43 through 44. So I'm going to just read this here. Here we have in verse 42, this kind of prayer of Jesus to his Father. Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done. Now, it's at verse 43, we have an angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. And being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. So this is an interesting, unique statement that's in Luke because it, highlights Jesus in his humanity, as it were. Uh, you know, Genuinely feeling, as it were, concerned about what was getting ready to happen to him, and the kind of intensity. So there's an intensity that's described here, which one doesn't get in reading Matthew, Mark, and certainly not in John's account. So someone might have read that and get a sense that, oh, Jesus is very frightened or fearful, anxious almost about what's getting ready to happen. And so some scribes may have saw that and thought that that was inappropriate in a way of describing Jesus. And so what's interesting here about the manuscript is some of our early manuscripts don't have this, verses 43 and 44. And so we don't know if it's really a Lucan, reflects a Lucan redaction. Now, it could, if we are thinking, yes, this was a part of the original text. Some scribes didn't like it and left it out because it gave the wrong impression about Jesus. They thought it was added in and that it shouldn't have been there. And so they left it out because they thought it was a mistaken addition. Or it wasn't originally there, and some scribes picking up a tradition about this. Maybe someone had written this tradition on the side of a manuscript. They thought that these comments on the side was actually part of the text and had gotten left out or been missed by a previous scribe, and so they added it in. So there's a little bit of complexity about these verses. If they were original, it is then part of the Lucan redaction activity of taking materials and helping to push, as it were, Jesus's frailty or his humanness in this. That as a human being facing the possibility of death, that although he was obedient, he nevertheless could still be anxious about that. This sweat like drops of blood. But if it's not original, then it doesn't show Lucan redaction. It shows instead the church's tradition and how it's trying to intensify this scene with Jesus in the Mount of Olives. All right, I just wanted to give a little bit of kind of background on some of these elements that show Luke's redaction activities and the things that might help us to appreciate how Luke wants to tell the story of Jesus.